The wind across the Nebraska prairie in the autumn of 1887 was not a sound. It was a presence. It had a weight and a texture, scouring the land with a relentless, granular hiss that promised an end to all things warm. For Ilara, newly widowed and utterly alone on her 10-acre plot, the wind was a sermon of annihilation, a constant reminder of the coming cold and the hollowness in her chest where her husband's warmth used to be. Her husband, Anton, had been a man of quiet strength, his hands calloused from work, his eyes holding the distant memory of a land much like this one, but different. He had spoken of the Ukrainian steppes, of winters that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs before it could form a cloud. He had died in the summer, taken by a fever that burned through him in 3 short days, leaving Ilara with a half-finished cabin, a mountain of debt, and the ghost of his accent in the empty rooms. The community of Prosperity, a raw and hopeful collection of clapboard and log structures a few miles east, had offered condolences that felt more like assessments. They looked at Ilara, a woman of 24 with hands too slender for farm work and eyes that held a scholar's sorrow rather than a pioneer's grit, and they saw a problem. She was a line item in the town's ledger of social responsibilities, a burden waiting to be shouldered. The women brought casseroles and pitying looks. The men offered advice that sounded like warnings. The consensus was clear, articulated most forcefully by Silas Croft, the town's master builder. Croft was a man built of straight lines and firm convictions. His log cabins, erected with a speed and uniformity he equated with genius, were the very image of the town's name. They were symbols of man's triumph over the wilderness, each log hewn and notched with geometric precision, the gaps filled with a plaster of his own devising. He saw Ilara's half-finished cabin, a structure Anton had begun with methods Croft considered archaic and inefficient, and he had shaken his head with the weary patience of a master correcting a foolish apprentice. "Your husband, bless his heart, was a dreamer, not a builder," he had declared, his voice booming as if to fill the vast emptiness of the prairie. "This joinery is sentimental. The roof pitch is too shallow. It won't shed the snows we get here. You need a proper cabin, Mrs. Hayes. A Croft cabin." And a Croft cabin required a Croft stove. A magnificent black iron beast that sat in the center of the room, devouring cords of wood and radiating a fierce, immediate heat that was as impressive as it was transient. The iron stove was the heart of the modern homestead, a symbol of industrial power brought to the frontier. It was also a voracious monster, demanding a constant tribute of fuel that was already becoming scarce on the largely treeless plains. The settlers of Prosperity prided themselves on these stoves, on the roaring fires they could build against the cold, never questioning the sheer volume of cottonwood and scavenged oak they consumed. Theirs was a battle of brute force against the elements, a war of attrition they were certain they were winning. Ilara, with her dwindling woodpile and non-existent income, could not afford to even enlist in such a war. She had Anton's land, or what she thought of as Anton's land, 10 acres of rolling prairie, distinguished only by a small, south-facing hillock that Anton had been inexplicably fond of. He used to sit there in the evenings, watching the sun set, a strange, placid look on his face. "Good earth," he would murmur, crumbling the dark soil in his hands. "This hill has a strong back." Ilara hadn't understood. To her, it was just a lump of dirt that made plowing more difficult. The land, she would soon learn, was not truly hers. It belonged to a bank in Omaha, a distant and faceless entity whose local agent was Mr. Abernathy. Abernathy was a man who seemed to have been assembled from mismatched parts. A perpetually worried brow sat atop a pair of cold, calculating eyes. He dressed in city clothes that were always dusty, a man perpetually out of place. He arrived in early November, his buggy kicking up a cloud of ochre dust that the wind immediately seized and flung away. He did not come alone. Silas Croft was with him, a silent, imposing witness. They did not enter her home. They stood by the door, hats in hand, as a perfunctory nod to her widowhood, but their posture was all business. Abernathy cleared his throat, a dry, rustling sound. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, consulting a sheaf of papers. "As you know, your late husband's loan payments have been in arrears since his passing." Alara nodded. She knew. The knowledge was a stone in her gut. "The bank has been patient," Abernathy continued, unable to meet her gaze, focusing instead on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "But winter approaches. The property, as it stands, is not considered a viable homestead. It is untenable." It was Croft who supplied the next brutal word. "Unfinished," the builder said, his eyes sweeping over the cabin with contempt. "And unfinishable by your hand. The structure is unsound. It's a death trap." Abernathy seized on the word. A death trap, indeed. The bank cannot, in good conscience, hold the note on a property that is, for all intents and purposes, uninhabitable, especially given your circumstances. He gestured vaguely at her, a gesture that encompassed her gender, her solitude, her grief. "What are you saying, Mr. Abernathy?" Alara's voice was small, nearly lost to the wind. "The bank is foreclosing," he said, the words finally tumbling out, a relief to him. "We are taking possession of the land and the assets thereon." He held out a paper. It was an eviction notice. "Legally, this is effective immediately. However," he attempted a smile that was a grimace, "given the season and out of respect for your situation, we will not send the sheriff until the first heavy snow. A small grace period. I would advise you to make arrangements to return east, or perhaps seek charity within the town." "This is woman's folly," his eyes said. "This is the inevitable end for those who cannot cope." Croft stepped forward, his shadow falling over her. "He's right, missus. There's no shame in it. This land is hard. It takes a certain kind of strength. Your best hope now is the Church Aid Society. They'll find you a place." They turned and left her there, a piece of paper trembling in her hand, the wind snatching at it as if to tear it away and deliver the final verdict. She was sentenced, not to a prison of stone and iron, but to one of cold and wind and snow. They'd condemned her to the winter, confident in their judgment, their pity a sharper blade than their scorn. She stood on the porch of her half-built home, the sentence of foreclosure in her hand, and watched their buggy disappear into the vast, indifferent landscape. The wind howled its agreement. The case was closed. That night, Alara did not sleep. She sat in the one finished room of the cabin, a single candle casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The cold was already seeping through the gaps in the chinking, a precursor of the killing frost to come. Despair was a physical weight pressing down on her, stealing the very air from her lungs. She looked around the small space, at the few meager possessions that constituted her life. Anton's books, her own small collection of pressed flowers, and a heavy, leather-bound trunk in the corner. It was Anton's grandmother's trunk, brought all the way from the old country. He had treated it with a reverence that bordered on superstition. Alara had never looked inside. It was part of his world, a world that was now lost to her. Driven by a bleak, final curiosity, she knelt and unlatched the heavy clasps. The hinges groaned in protest. The air that rose from within smelled of dried herbs, of old paper, and of earth. Inside, nestled amongst bundles of dried lavender and strange, carved wooden figures, were a series of journals. They were bound in worn leather, filled with dense Cyrillic script that she could not read. But interspersed with the alien text were drawings, dozens of them. Sketches made with a steady, practical hand. They depicted not houses, but hills, or rather, houses and hills. She pulled one out, her hands trembling. It showed a cross-section, a diagram of a structure dug into the side of a slope. The text was meaningless, but the drawing was a universal language. It showed a deep excavation, walls lined with stone, and a thick, sod-covered roof that blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. It showed a massive central masonry structure, a stove, she realized, with intricate channels drawn to show the flow of air and smoke. Arrows indicated the sun's path, low in the winter sky, its rays penetrating a large, south-facing window. Words were scrawled next to the arrows, and she recognized one from Anton's quiet murmurings. Sans. Sun. Another arrow pointed to the earth surrounding the structure, labeled with a word she'd heard him use to describe the rich bottomland soil. Zemlya. Earth. She pulled out another journal, and another. They were filled with variations on the same theme. A zemlyanka, the old name surfaced in her memory, an earth shelter. Page after page of detailed blueprints for survival, drawn not by an architect, but by generations of necessity. They explained how the earth itself, the zemlya, with its immense thermal mass, could be a shield against the biting wind and a reservoir of steady, constant temperature. The ground, a few feet below the surface, remained a consistent temperature year-round, a gentle coolness in summer, a relative warmth in winter. The journals showed how to harness this. They showed how to build a peck, a masonry heater. Unlike Croft's gluttonous iron stoves that flared hot and died fast, the peck was a slow, deliberate giant. A short, hot fire in its core would heat hundreds of pounds of brick and clay, which would then radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth for 12, even 24 hours. It was a heart of stone, hoarding heat, giving it back slowly, faithfully. The final piece of the puzzle was the sun. The drawings were insistent on a southern orientation, on a large glazed opening not just for light, but for heat. The low winter sun would pour through the glass and the heat would be trapped inside, absorbed by the stone floor and the earthen walls, to be released slowly through the long, cold night. Passive solar gain, they called it, in books she could not read. The grandmother from the steppes had simply called it common sense. Ilara sat on the floor, the journals spread around her, the single candle burning low. The wind howled outside, testing the integrity of Croft's world. But in the flickering light, another world was taking shape. A world of earth and sun, of thermal mass and radiant heat. It was a blueprint for a fortress. A fortress not of wood and iron, but of dirt and stone and light. A desperate, audacious hope began to bloom in the frozen soil of her heart. They had kicked her out in November. They had sentenced her to the winter. They expected her to fail, to flee, to freeze. They did not know Anton's grandmother. They did not know the power of Zemlya. She looked at her soft hands, her slender frame. She looked at the eviction notice, a slip of paper against a world of knowledge. She began that very day. The first strike of the spade against the hard November earth of Anton's favorite hill was a shock that traveled up her arms and into her shoulders. The ground was not yet frozen solid, but it was resistant, unforgiving. The work was brutal, a scale of labor she could scarcely comprehend, let alone perform. Her first hour of digging produced a pathetic mound of dirt and a constellation of blisters on her palms. Pain lanced through her back. Doubt, cold and sharp as the wind, whispered in her ear. This is impossible. Croft was right. This is folly. She stopped, leaning on the spade, her breath coming in ragged clouds. She looked at the half-finished cabin, a monument to a failed dream. She looked at the vast, empty prairie, a promise of a cold, lonely death. Then she looked at the drawing in the journal she had propped against a rock. The simple, confident lines. The arrows showing the earth embracing the home, protecting it. She remembered Anton's words. This hill has a strong back. She wrapped her torn hands in strips of cloth from her petticoat, gripped the spade, and struck the earth again. And again. The rhythm of the work became her world. Dig, lift, throw, step. The universe shrank to the bite of the shovel, the weight of the earth, the ache in her muscles. She was not building a house. She was excavating a future. Bucket by agonizing bucket, she carved a cavity into the south-facing slope, a rectangular wound 10 feet deep, 20 feet wide, and 15 feet long. The town of Prosperity watched, when it bothered to look at all. Riders on their way to hunt or check traps would rein in their horses at the crest of the ridge and stare down at the lone, small figure toiling at the base of the hill. The story spread, an amusing anecdote to share over the heat of their iron stoves. The widow Hayes lost her mind, they'd say, digging her own grave out on the prairie. Silas Croft himself made a special trip. He rode out on his handsome gelding, Mr. Abernathy once again in tow, their curiosity piqued by the town gossip. They found her waist deep in the earth, her face smeared with dirt, her hair escaping its bun in wild strands. She was a feral thing, a creature of the mud. Croft dismounted, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, Mrs. Hayes, an interesting choice of pastime. Practicing for a root cellar?" Alara paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a muddy forearm. She did not waste her breath on a reply. She simply met his gaze, her eyes clear and steady. Abernathy fidgeted. "This is highly irregular. The bank still holds the deed, you know. We can't have you destabilizing the land." "She's digging a hole, man." "Let her," Croft chuckled, his voice thick with condescension. "It's a fine thing for a woman to have a hobby. Keeps her from melancholia." He surveyed the immense pile of excavated earth, the neat rectangular pit. For a moment, a flicker of professional interest crossed his face. The lines were surprisingly straight. The depth was uniform, but he quickly suppressed it. "You'll catch your death of cold out here, missus. This is man's work, and pointless work at that. When the first snow comes, this hole will be a fine place for the coyotes to shelter." He turned to Abernathy. "See? Woman's folly. We were right to wash our hands of it. Let the winter have her." They mounted their horses and rode away, their laughter carried back to her on the wind. Their mockery was meant to be a final nail in her coffin, but it was fuel. Their certainty was a whetstone for her resolve. She worked on. As the pit deepened, the nature of the labor changed. She had to build a ramp to haul the dirt out with a rickety wheelbarrow she'd repaired. She hit a layer of clay and stone, and her digging slowed to a crawl. She learned the art of the pry bar, of finding leverage, of using her body's weight, not just its strength. Every muscle screamed, but every day, the hole grew deeper, more real. She was not just digging, she was shaping. She was imposing the grandmother's vision onto the unyielding Nebraska soil. While the earthwork continued, she began the second, more intricate phase, the construction of the petch. The journals were precise. She salvaged bricks from a collapsed chimney on an abandoned homestead miles away, hauling them back 2 at a time in a burlap sack on her back. The journey took a full day. She made a dozen such journeys, a small, determined ant, moving mountains one crumb at a time. She found a good source of clay by the creek bed and spent days mixing it with sand and straw, stomping it with her bare feet until it had the perfect consistency for mortar. Building the masonry heater was a slow, sacred process. It was not like building a wall. It was like building a heart. She laid the first course of bricks, forming the base and the ash pit. Then, following the diagrams, she began to construct the intricate, serpentine channels through which the hot gases would travel. This was the genius of the petch. The smoke and heat from the fire would not go straight up a chimney, carrying most of their energy with them. Instead, they would be forced on a long, winding journey through the brick labyrinth, their heat leaching into the masonry at every turn, until what finally emerged from the flue was a cool, clean exhaust. She laid each brick with painstaking care, sealing the joints with her clay mortar, her hands becoming as skilled as any mason's. It rose in the center of her excavated space, a squat, powerful altar to warmth. As the petch cured, she turned to the walls and roof. She lined the earthen walls of the pit with a layer of field stones she gathered from the prairie, creating a solid, dry barrier. For the roof, she used the timbers from Anton's half-finished cabin. Deconstructing his dream was a painful task, each nail she pulled a small pang of guilt. But it was a necessary sacrifice. She was not destroying his work. She was repurposing it, transforming it. She laid the main beams across the 15-foot span, then the rafters. It was heavy, dangerous work for one person. She used leverage, fulcrums, and sheer, stubborn determination. The front of the structure, the south-facing wall, was the most critical. It was not a wall of earth, but a wall of light. She framed it with the last of the good lumber, leaving a wide opening in the center. For the glass, she made a final, desperate gamble. She took the last of her money, the few silver dollars Anton had hidden away, and traveled to the next town over, where a trading post had a supply of window glass shipped from the east. The proprietor looked at the dirt-streaked woman with the calloused hands and the fierce eyes, and sold her the panes without asking questions. Transporting them back was a nightmare. She built a special crate for her wheelbarrow, padded with prairie grass. Every bump in the rough track was a jolt of terror, but they arrived intact. Glazing the window was the last act of construction. As she sealed the final pane in place with a putty of clay and linseed oil, a pale November sunbeam lanced through the glass and struck the far earthen wall. It was a benediction. The final task was the most grueling. She had to move the mountain of earth she had excavated back onto the roof. She laid a thick layer of oiled canvas over the rafters for waterproofing, and then, bucket by bucket, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, she piled the earth back on. A foot deep, then 2. She packed it down, layering it, until the wooden structure was buried beneath a thick blanket of insulating soil. Lastly, she transplanted the tough prairie sod she had so carefully saved, laying it over the earthen roof like a living quilt. When she was done, the structure had all but vanished back into the hill. All that was visible from the north, east, or west was the gentle slope of the land. Only from the south could one see the single, wood-framed wall with its large, glassy eye staring out at the prairie. By the first week of December, it was done. She moved her few belongings inside. The interior was dark, smelling of damp earth and curing clay. It was a cave, a tomb, just as Croft had predicted. She lit a small, tentative fire in the firebox of the petch. The kindling caught, and for a terrifying moment, a puff of smoke backdrafted into the room. Then, the draft caught. A gentle, hungry roar echoed from the belly of the beast. The smoke disappeared up the flue. She fed the fire for an hour, a hot, fast blaze of scavenged cottonwood, then closed the heavy iron door and let it die. There was no immediate, roaring heat like that from an iron stove. There was only stillness. The air remained cold. The doubt returned, a bitter, icy wave. Had it all been for nothing? Had she built a magnificent, elaborate failure? Exhausted, heartbroken, she wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep on the packed earth floor. She awoke not to a sound, but to a feeling. A gentle, pervasive sense of not cold. The air was not warm, not in the way of a fire-heated room. It was simply not cold. The biting, invasive chill of the prairie was gone, replaced by a neutral, steady calm. She placed her hand on the brick of the peck. It was not hot to the touch, but radiated a deep, profound warmth, like a sun-baked stone in the late afternoon. It was working. The heart of stone was beating, slowly, steadily, pushing back the cold. That morning, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the gentle, picturesque flakes of memory, but hard, tiny pellets driven by a rising wind. The grace period was over. Her sentence was beginning. But as she stood inside her wall of glass, watching the world turn white, she was not afraid. She was sealed in her hillside, protected by 2 feet of earth, a heart of brick, and the wisdom of a woman she had never met. Let the winter come. She was ready. The winter of 1888 did not arrive. It attacked. It is remembered in the annals of the plains not as a season, but as a singular, malevolent event. The school children's blizzard. It began, as the most treacherous things do, with a lie. The morning of January 12th was unseasonably, deceptively mild. A false spring that coaxed farmers from their homes without heavy coats and sent children to their one-room schoolhouses in light woolens. In the town of Prosperity, the thaw was a welcome respite. People rejoiced in the brief reprieve from the numbing cold, congratulating themselves on their sturdy cabins and their powerful stoves. The consumption of wood had been prodigious, but the end of winter felt, for a few hours, tantalizingly close. Silas Croft stood in his general store, holding court as usual. "See," he boomed, gesturing to the clear sky. "A good, solid home and a hot fire. That's the key. Tames the wilderness every time." He thought, for a fleeting moment, of the mad widow in her dirt hole. He imagined it was a muddy, miserable pit in the thaw. He snorted. Some people had to learn the hard way. Around noon, the lie was exposed. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue, turned a sickly, yellowish gray in the north. The wind, which had been a gentle, southerly breeze, fell utterly silent. An unnerving, absolute stillness descended on the prairie, a silence so profound it felt like a held breath. Then, with the speed of an express train, the northern horizon dissolved into a churning, white wall. It was not a storm, it was a physical blow. The temperature plummeted, dropping 50 degrees in less than 3 hours. The wind hit not as a gale, but as a solid entity, a hurricane of powdered ice and killing cold. Visibility dropped to 0. The world beyond one's arm vanished into a roaring, white chaos. To be caught outside was a death sentence. Inside the log cabins of Prosperity, the celebration ended. The wind found every tiny gap in the chinking, every crack around the window frames, every space between the floorboards. It forced its way in, not as a draft, but as a constant, pressurized flow of Arctic air. The cabins, which had seemed so solid, were revealed to be little more than porous sieves. The magnificent iron stoves became ravenous tyrants. They had to be fed constantly, their fires roaring at maximum capacity just to create a small, shrinking bubble of survivable warmth in the center of the room. The heat rose straight to the ceiling, while at floor level, water froze in buckets. Families huddled around the hot iron, their fronts scorching while their backs froze. The roar of the stove and the shriek of the wind became the soundtrack to their terror. And they began to run out of wood. The piles they thought would last until March were dwindling at an alarming rate. Men made desperate, life-threatening dashes to their wood piles, often just a few yards from their doors, and some did not make it back. In his own masterfully built home, Silas Croft faced the failure of his life's work. The plaster he had invented was cracking and falling out from the force of the wind. A fine, glittering dust of snow was being driven directly through the logs, coating every surface in a crystalline tracery of failure. His wife and 2 small children were huddled under a mountain of blankets, their faces pale, their lips blue. He had stuffed every crack with rags, with clothing, with pages torn from books, but the cold was winning. He fed the last of his split oak into the stove, then the furniture, a chair, a small table. The wood, unseasoned, burned with a smoky, unsatisfying fire. His pride had turned to ash, and now his home was following. The storm raged for a day, and then a night, and then another day. Trapped in the screaming white darkness, time lost all meaning. It was on the second night, with the last of the kitchen chairs broken up and the fire little more than a sullen glow in the belly of the iron monster, that a thought, unwelcome and persistent, lodged itself in Croft's mind. The widow. The woman in the hill. He imagined her, frozen solid in her muddy pit. A grim, satisfying image of his own correctness. But the image wavered. He remembered the straight lines of her excavation, the quiet confidence in her eyes, the sheer, unyielding determination. What if? The question was an act of heresy against the church of his own ego. What if she wasn't dead? Guilt, or perhaps a morbid, desperate curiosity, began to gnaw at him. He had condemned her. He had laughed at her. He had ridden away, secure in his superiority, and left her to this. His own family was freezing, his expertise a sham. What was one more folly in a world that had gone mad? "I'm going for more wood," he lied to his wife, his voice a raw croak. He wrapped himself in the last of the blankets, pulled his hat down low, and tied a rope around his waist, securing the other end to the iron door latch. A lifeline. He opened the door, and the storm fell upon him. The journey was an odyssey through a frozen hell. He could not see. He could not hear anything but the shriek of the wind. He moved by instinct, by a desperate memory of the landscape, pulling himself along the fence line that marked the edge of his property. The cold was a living thing, a predator that clawed at his face, stole the breath from his lungs, and sought the warmth of his heart. Every step was a battle. He fell a dozen times, the snow a deep, suffocating powder. The rope was his only connection to reality, his only hope of return. It took him an hour to travel the half-mile to her hill. He found it more by luck than by navigation, stumbling into the slope and recognizing its shape. He crawled on his hands and knees, shouting her name into the wind, the sound instantly ripped from his lips. He was looking for a grave, a mound of snow where her hole used to be. He was a penitent, come to witness the final proof of his own terrible judgment. He saw it first as a distortion in the white chaos, a faint, rectangular smudge. It was not bright. It was a gentle, warm glow, so subtle that at first he thought his freezing brain was creating phantoms. He crawled closer. It was the window. It was not covered in snow. The glass was clear. The warmth from within was melting the snow as it landed. He pulled himself up to it, his hands numb, his face a mask of ice. He peered inside. The sight that met his eyes did not compute. His mind, shattered by the cold and the wind, could not process the scene. It was a vision from another world, a world without storms, a world without fear. The interior of the earth shelter was calm, still. The air was so quiet he could feel the silence through the glass. A single candle burned on a small wooden table, its flame perfectly upright, untroubled by any draft. The light was soft, golden, illuminating a space that was not a cave or a tomb, but a room, a home. Ilara was there. She was not huddled in blankets. She was wearing a simple wool dress. She sat on a low stool, her back to the warm brick of the petch, reading a book. The air around her was serene. On the floor, a small cat, a stray she must have taken in, was curled up, asleep. The temperature, he knew with an instinct born of his own freezing misery, was not hot. It was a steady, comfortable, living warmth. 65 degrees, perhaps. A miracle. And then he saw the final, impossible detail. Along the base of the long, south-facing window, she had built a shallow trough of earth, a planter box that ran the length of the wall. In the dark, rich soil, under the gentle light of the sun, captured and held from the day before, were rows of tiny green shoots. Lettuce. Herbs. In the heart of the white death, surrounded by a world frozen into a monolithic block of ice, Ilara Hayes was planting a garden. The smell of fresh bread seemed to emanate from the very walls. He did not knock. He did not have the strength. His mind finally broke under the strain of the contradiction. His world of iron and force had failed utterly, leaving him frozen and defeated. Her world of earth and light had created a pocket of impossible spring in the heart of a biblical winter. He slid down the wall, his back against the warm stones of her foundation, and wept. The tears froze on his cheeks. He collapsed. He awoke to warmth, a profound, bone-deep warmth that seemed to be pulling him back from a great, cold distance. He was inside. He was lying on a soft pallet of straw and blankets on the floor. The cat was sniffing his face. Ilara was kneeling beside him, spooning a hot, savory broth into his mouth. She did not speak. Her eyes held no triumph, no "I told you so." They held only a deep, quiet compassion. "How?" he finally croaked, his throat raw. For an answer, she simply patted the warm brick of the petch beside them. She pointed to the thick earthen walls, to the massive, insulated roof above them, and then to the great window, where even in the gray stormlight, the green shoots seemed to be reaching for life. She showed him the grandmother's journal, open to a diagram of the thermal mass of the earth. Not with wood, not with coal, but with this, with wisdom. He was the first. He was not the last. Later that day, a second, half-frozen shape appeared at the door. It was Abernathy, the land agent. He had made a desperate run from his own failing cabin, seeking the shelter of the Croft house, only to find it empty and cold. In a final, desperate gamble, he had followed Croft's tracks in the snow before they were obliterated. He stumbled into the Zemlyanka and stared, his jaw slack with disbelief, at the sight of his fellow skeptic, Silas Croft, sipping broth in a warm, well-lit room. He, too, was taken in. For 2 more days, the storm raged, and for 2 more days, the widow's folly was an ark. It became a sanctuary. Her small, 10 by 20-foot space, built with her own 2 hands, sheltered the very men who had condemned her. They, the masters of the prairie, the builders and the bankers, were reduced to humble, grateful supplicants, kept alive by the quiet competence of the woman they had dismissed. They watched her tend her impossible garden. They watched her knead dough and bake bread in the residual heat of her miraculous stove. They did not speak of what was happening in the town, of the wives and children they had left behind. They didn't have to. The terror was a shared, unspoken presence. Their salvation inside this earthen womb only highlighted the damnation outside. When the wind finally died and the sun rose on a world transformed, a world of sculpted, silent white, Silas Croft stood at the door of the Zemlyanka. He looked out at the glittering, alien landscape. His own house was a snowdrift. The town was a series of mounds. He turned back to Alara. "Everything I knew was wrong," he said, the admission costing him the last burnt remnants of his pride. "Everything I built was a failure. This," he gestured around the warm living space, "this is the only thing that makes sense." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "You must teach me." The story of the widow's ark spread through the devastated community like a wildfire. In the aftermath of the blizzard, as the grim accounting of losses began, the tale of the warm, thriving earth shelter seemed a thing of myth. But the proof was there, in the form of Silas Croft and Mr. Abernathy, alive and humbled. Search parties, expecting to find a frozen corpse, found Alara Hayes instead, doling out hot bread and handing out fresh greens from her winter garden. They found her not just surviving, but flourishing. The change in her status was seismic. She was no longer the poor widow, the town burden. She was the woman who had stared into the eye of the White Death and not blinked. She was the keeper of a deeper magic, a sage of sun and earth. Mr. Abernathy, on his own initiative and without consulting the distant bank in Omaha, tore up her eviction notice and the mortgage papers. He hand-delivered her the clear deed to her 10 acres, an offering of profound atonement. Debts were not just forgiven, they were forgotten, irrelevant in the face of her demonstrated wisdom. True to his word, Silas Croft became her most devoted pupil. The master builder, his reputation in tatters, his confidence shattered, arrived at her hill not with mockery, but with a toolkit and a notebook. He brought his crew, rough men who had once snickered at the woman digging a hole, and they stood in awkward silence, hats in hand, ready to learn. Alara, who had never sought to be a leader, became a teacher. She did not lecture, she demonstrated. With Croft translating her quiet instructions and his own dawning comprehension into the language of builders, they began. She showed them the principles of the Zemlyanka, of thermal mass and the Earth's stable temperature. She explained the meticulous art of the petch, the slow heart that hoarded heat. She drew diagrams in the dirt, showing them how to orient a home to the sun, how to use glass not just for light, but as a furnace. That spring and summer, a revolution in architecture took place on the Nebraska prairie. The frantic, inefficient construction of flimsy log cabins ceased. Instead, under Alara's guidance, the people of prosperity began to dig. They built into the gentle slopes, creating homes that were protected, insulated, and energy efficient. They quarried stone and mixed clay for their own masonry heaters, each one a testament to a new way of thinking. The town's name, once a hopeful boast, began to feel like an earned reality. Silas Croft, reborn as a craftsman of substance rather than a merchant of speed, became the leading proponent of the new style. His new homes were hybrids of American ingenuity and Ukrainian tradition. Beautiful, practical structures, half buried in the earth, with great south-facing windows that drank the sunlight. The community, which had once been on the brink of collapse, became known throughout the territory for its resilience, for its strange and wonderful houses that were warm in winter and cool in summer. They became known as the town that had tamed the winter. Ilara never sought the spotlight. She remained on her 10 acres, her own zemlyanka, now the heart of a small, thriving homestead. But her transformation was complete. The isolated outcast had become the respected cornerstone of her community. People came to her not for charity, but for advice on crop rotation, on seed saving, on the proper way to build a cold frame. She had been vindicated, not by argument or by anger, but by the undeniable, irrefutable fact of a green shoot growing in the dead of winter. Years passed. The prairie healed from the scars of the great blizzard. The town of Prosperity grew, its unique, earth-sheltered homes a living legacy of that terrible winter and the quiet woman who had unlocked its secret. The story concludes not with a grand monument, but with a small, enduring image. Ilara, her hair now the color of snow, sits in the sun-drenched common room of the town's new school, itself a magnificent zemlyanka, surrounded by the grandchildren of the men who once mocked her. She is not telling them stories of the great storm. She is showing them something far more important. She is pressing a single tiny seed into the waiting hands of a child and teaching them how to plant a garden.